All right, good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us this morning for the Cyber Risk Management webinar. My name is Lori Little, and I'm the Director of Communications with the Oregon Restaurant and Lodging Association. And ORLA is very pleased to work with such great allied partners like Ward Insurance and be able to provide valuable content and intelligence on topics that are timely and relevant to the hospitality industry. We have been fortunate to partner with Ward on a few occasions. This past November, Anne, along with a partner from Tonkintorp, joined us on ORLA's Boiled Down podcast to discuss employment law and COVID considerations. That was episode 32, in case you missed it. First, I would like to share a few housekeeping notes. Of course, all participants will remain muted. We certainly invite your comments and questions, so please use the chat feature to type in your questions, and we'll address those during the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and a link will be made available along with the presentation deck. So watch for a follow-up email on that. So let me introduce the presenter this morning. Anne Hasenstab is the Executive Risk and Cybersecurity Practice Leader for Ward Insurance based in Portland, Oregon. She has spent the last 19 years of her career specializing in insurance products designed to mitigate the economic damage caused by terrible human behavior, anything from corporate fraud to workplace violence, cyber terrorism, and kidnappings. Anne began her career in Chicago, Illinois, working as an executive risk underwriter for Chubb Insurance, and later a management liability insurance agent, primarily serving Fortune 500 clients within all industry classes. Most recently, Anne held underwriting management roles throughout the Pacific Northwest with both Travelers and Chubb, and is currently the president of the CSNP, or Cybersecurity Nonprofit Portland chapter. That was a mouthful. Welcome, Anne, and the screen is all yours.
Great. Well, thanks everybody. Thanks for having me today. We have a jam-packed webinar for you today, as most are on this topic. And really just to reemphasize, I do come from an insurance background, so we really crafted this to make sure that you're aware of the resources and the risk management tools to help mitigate this exposure. We're definitely going to talk about the fun headline making, breaches and attacks that are out there. That kind of adds to the interest, but definitely level sets and kind of gives you that foundation of, what we're trying to protect you against, and really would like this to be very conversational. So we do have a chat function here on the webinar, so feel free to enter any questions. We have left some room at the end for Q&A. This presentation tends to run a little long. If we don't get to the Q&A, feel free to reach out to me directly. I'm happy to answer any questions as we go along. So let's get started. So I'll actually hold off on a quick introduction for the next slide, but we are definitely going to walk through the agenda here today to kind of, again, give that foundation of what the threat environment looks like, what the kind of claims trends we're seeing in the insurance space and how we're addressing them, and then move into the risk management. How can we actually prevent, reduce your exposure? What are the tools and resources out there? One of the big takeaways from this presentation today is that I really want you to leave here knowing that the insurance products that are out there and available to you, the risk management products, have definitely evolved from where they were even just from a few years ago. So if you haven't checked the market and received any sort of quote, definitely look into that now, because it's much more than just an insurance contract these days. They're pushing out quite a bit of IT security resources, complementary to policyholders, things like that. So think of it as very much a comprehensive risk management tool for your organization. I do like to debunk a couple of cyber myths as to why people don't buy the coverage. And I think by the time we get there, you'll have a full understanding of the need. And then I do want to share with you best practices and some resources of just suggestions, especially in the time of, COVID, post-COVID, remote environments, things of the new exposures that we've seen in the past year and beyond. And then again, we'll have some time for Q&A. Quick legal disclaimer. Don't trust anything I have to say. I'm not an attorney, all that good stuff. But yeah, this is just meant to be educational only. Here's my quick, I like to joke and say this is my pre-COVID profile picture. But yeah, I'm the executive risk practice leader and cybersecurity practice leader for Ward Insurance. I'm located here in Portland. We also have, and as many of you know, we have a hospitality practice. A dedicated practice leader with Hannah Harderson is leading up that practice for us. So I work a lot with Hannah, with our hospitality clients, and especially in this space of cyber risk. I also handle directors and officers liability, employment practices liability, crime insurance, all that stuff that falls under what you would call management liability. So let's dig straight in. I like to kind of just start here. What is cyber risk? A lot of folks really think they understand what cyber is. Based on the name cyber, we're always thinking about computer systems and technology, but there's actually a lot more to it and what we're trying to capture as far as the actual risk profile and what we're trying to cover in the insurance industry. So let's start there. I like to personally break things down into a couple of buckets just for explanation and ease of understanding. And this is the best approach I think I've come up with these days, is just really understanding cyber risk in kind of these two main categories. One is your risks associated with the computers and the technology that you're using, right? So that's what we would call under the umbrella of network security risk, right? So you've got, anywhere from your laptops on your desktop, your PCs, your mobile devices, the IoT devices, that stands for Internet of Things. So anything that you have that has smart in front of it, maybe connected to the Wi-Fi. These are kind of those types of exposures from a network standpoint that can kind of put you out there into the greater region of, hackability and things like that. Industrial control systems, that's another thing I want to kind of make everyone aware of. Think about your temperature gauges on your walls, or the security that's on your front door of your restaurant or hotel. These are all mini computer systems. You kind of have to think beyond what's the computer in front of you, but what actually technologically constitutes a computer system and a network, right? We actually have seen cases where there are, hackable situations where it came through the boiler room, because we've got, connectivity with those kind of servers reporting information into a main server system. So think about industrial control systems and what the actual structure of the building looks like, and what computers are talking to the other ones. Unified communication systems, if you heard of voice over IP, then we've got things related to, your phone lines now being connected to, digitally through the internet. So the hackability and kind of exposures there. Then beyond anything that you have with your restaurant or hotel or your own organization, think about the dependent systems that you're relying on, right? So that could be anywhere from Microsoft, Adobe, like some of the software platforms, but your web hosting providers, your cloud service providers, those systems, and your dependency on them. What does it look like when those fail? And we'll talk about that in a second. The other category to that, so that's, I think everyone kind of understands, your risks associated with the actual tangible hardware and the systems, but what about data and information that comes and goes? So let's talk about, your risks associated with collecting, storing, disseminating, hosting data, whether or not it's even passing through and going right to, your point of sale or your data storage provider. There is a liability that exists there when you do capture information from, credit card information or even employee information at your own source, right? So when we talk about PII, and I will give you a heads up, the insurance industry loves acronyms. So definitely ask me in our chat function if I kind of blow through one, but PII stands for personally identifiable information, right? So that could be anything from your first and last name, from driver's license numbers, social security numbers, credit card, all that good stuff. And we'll chat about the regulatory situation around PII. Beyond that, definitely look at information that you may carry on your own employee and your staff, right? So then you've got all the, the W-2s and, W-9s and like all the, any independent contractor information, any HR files, things like that. Then you get into possible customer information that might be proprietary, subject to non-disclosures. Corporate confidential information comes into play in certain industry classes as well. A big distinction too is to make sure that you understand we need to protect not only digital information that's passing, through emails, but also paper files too. We actually have seen claims where there are, unshredded W-2s blowing out on the street, right? And that's technically a breach scenario that you've not been able to protect that private information. So those are kind of the two main categories to kind of get us a good footing to understand cyber risk. When I first got into cyber, and it was back in 2003, I was a young underwriter transitioning into the brokerage side of the insurance agency. There was some state legislation passed specifically in California that was mandating, it was privacy notification law that was mandating if you failed to protect private information of consumers that lived in the state of California, then you were facing kind of a regulatory situation where you needed to make notification in a timely manner to those individuals, and so that they could kind of step in and remediate the situation if necessary, right? Since then, 50 states now have enacted the privacy notification type of law. And with that, because there's no federal legislation kind of streamlining that whole approach, you do have a pretty complex patchwork of different states, different requirements. Some are much more stringent than others. So when you do have a, quote unquote, breach of data, of information, let's say you find out that somebody's been in your system, a bad guy's been in your system, forensics gets in there, and there's a batch of maybe an email file that has some compromised PII in it. Those forensics folks and the legal folks that are helping you out are going to now figure out where do they reside and how do we make notification in a timely manner and what does that notification look like. So all of those things kind of cost money, right? So that's kind of the level set on the state situation. California has now upped the ante and passed the CCPA, which really creates a much more sophisticated and much more stringent privacy law in that particular state. And we expect a lot more states to be following suit. At the federal level, while we don't have an all-encompassing federal breach notification law, we do have all other types of different laws and legislations that are out there. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with this kind of concept, but there's a lot of pieces of legislation that are doing one main thing, but also have buried in there other pieces that constitute things like privacy notification, right? So the FTC, Federal Trade Commission, has a whole bunch of laws and legislations out there. They also have some mandatory, privacy regulatory type, legislation out there as well. We also have HIPAA high tech, which I'm sure you're familiar with on the healthcare side, protecting healthcare information. Gramm-Leach-Bliley is another one that comes up quite a bit with our financial institutions. And then if you're doing business internationally, and again, this is like customers that are in an international space, there is more of that, what you would call kind of like the federal model, which is actually in the EU for the GDPR. So they do have blanket legislation there for privacy notification. So I think long story short, without getting into the nitty gritty of the legal environment, a lot of information, if not most, is pretty sensitive, pretty much requiring notification. And at the very least, you're going to have expenses digging into figuring out what needs to be notified, what constitutes, protected information under a various amount of laws. Who are the threat actors? So, first getting into this business, we were always kind of thinking, this is a couple decades ago, we were thinking, it's a 16-year-old hacker down in the basement hacking into computer systems. Some of that's true. And actually those hackers grew up with quite a bit of technology and the ability to get into much bigger honeypots, right? So you do see organized crime rings and little cyber gangs out there. Little, actually, I should clarify that. Little is more like sophisticated and very big. If anyone has heard of Anonymous as kind of, it's thought of more of an organized crime ring. It's actually not. It's more of a movement. Where you do see a lot of the hacktivist type things happening. So you could get the one-off hacktivists or maybe a organized crime kind of cyber gang activity who are band together to not only kind of hack in and destruct and or destroy and steal information, but also maybe with a purpose of shutting down, a particular institution or government entity or anything that they're kind of opposed against, using hacking as a weapon. The other kind of scary scenario is that if I would say you or I on the street, I'm not a person that knows how to hack into a computer system myself, right? I can talk about it, but I don't have the actual skill set to do it. If I form some sort of resentment or vendetta against a particular target, there is a capability of going onto the dark web and hiring hackers for hire, which is kind of a scary scenario. And you can hire packages of pre-infected servers, just see what you can get for your bang for your buck. And it's a pretty, you'd be almost alarmed to see how almost eBay or Amazon friendly these websites kind of look like in the dark web, where they have, a 2-for-1 cart special and things like that, where you can kind of just buy these kind of things on the dark web, which is pretty scary. Bigger picture, and some of the bigger headlines that you definitely see are state-sponsored adversaries. So, really big campaigns coming from other countries, directed and targeting critical infrastructure of the United States, things like that. And that will look like a particular attack on, software. The latest one is definitely the solar winds. We're going to talk about that in a second, presumably coming out of Russia, and really infecting a lot of computer systems and causing a lot of damage. One of the other big things I want you to leave this presentation with is really understanding that outside of all of the other threats, that we're really only thinking about that criminal hacker mentality. Don't forget the human factor. The human factor is something I refer to as just, you do have the kind of criminal element of rogue employees, but that actually could be distressed employees too, especially in our last year plus. And you've got, folks that are out of work, they're really struggling financially. They may be inclined to do whatever it takes to make money, right? So if they get a shoulder tap from a outside criminal to say, hey, bring this little box into your restaurant and get some fraudulent swipes, and we'll pay you X amount of money, they could be more enticed to do that, right? So that's kind of the rogue employee type stuff. Or if they're upset, they've been laid off, and they do have the capabilities of hacking into systems and kind of destructing information, destroying information. Those are possibilities too. There's a whole other subset, however, of just flat out human error, right? So human error could look like failing to shred W-2s. It could be, we actually had a claim where the windows on the mailing envelope were too large and they were showing social security numbers and went out in big batches, things like that. A very common one is using the wrong email address and forwarding proprietary unsecured information like social security numbers, any sort of attachment to the wrong email address. You got to figure out what happened and who's seen it, right? Another thing to point out that I like to just mention these days too is the criminal mentality has somewhat shifted, and we'll kind of
I think you froze, Anne.
2011, and really exploded from there. The top cyber threat exposures that we're seeing these days, and I'm sure everyone has seen the headlines, maybe has possibly unfortunately experienced themselves. Ransomware. Ransomware is a piece of malicious software that gets in your system, will encrypt proprietary information and kind of hold you hostage, in some ways, where that proprietary information is then encrypted, and the only encryption key is kind of sitting with the criminal element, right? So you have to pay some sort of ransomware, typically coming out in a cryptocurrency like a Bitcoin. I will share with you, in the past year and a half, 2 years, I personally had a client that experienced a 520 Bitcoin ransom on a server that was shutting down their manufacturing facility. So that today is probably up in the 20 million range. Back then was, the valuation for Bitcoin was a little bit less, but it was a good $4 or $5 million ransomware demand. We're seeing these completely skyrocket. And if the hacker and the bad guy understands and gets any sort of inkling that, whatever server or system that they have infiltrated and held hostage is critical to your business and could potentially shut you down for good, that ransom will continue to go up. Phishing and business email compromise. So we see a lot of click-throughs on emails, and once that happens, and phishing campaigns in general are fraudulent emails that come through. They kind of look legit, and then you'll click through it, and then what that does, and sometimes it'll prompt you to enter some passwords and login information, depending on what that phishing campaign looks. Accessible is it? So think about things like that, where you have mobile devices, laptops, things that are moving around outside of your actual walls and your perimeter. Again, third-party vendors and dependent systems. This is actually huge and making huge headlines currently. If anyone has heard of what 0-day means, 0-day is a vulnerability that could be exposed and exploited on various pieces of software, like Microsoft, Adobe, Apple have all kind of disclosed various 0-day vulnerabilities throughout the years. 0-day means that the good guys, the engineers and the developers on the software side have had 0 days to come up with any sort of patch to their kind of open vulnerability, right? So it's newly discovered. They've not seen it before. And so hackers, tends to be the big gold mine for hackers, right? To find that 0-day exploitation. They'll get into the system, and then it becomes kind of a race between the bad guys and the good guys who can patch it up quick. And then, the bad guys are trying to exploit as much as they can. So the stuff that you're seeing in the headlines now, we've got a 0-day situation with Microsoft Exchange right now. We've got other things that have made headlines in the past, especially with Adobe software and things like that. So you really do need to think about those types of exposures that happen to the software and potentially the vendors that you're relying on to keep your environment safe. They're not impenetrable by any means, and they are highly targeted. So when that happens, then let's say your Adobe software is compromised, they can come into your own systems, and then you have a situation that has landed on your plate, right? So things to think about. The other couple of pieces are remote access vulnerabilities. So especially in 2020, and when we've moved to folks that are remoting in to our main systems, you do need to make sure that you've got the proper security around what we call remote access protocol, so our remote desktop protocol, so RDPs. And we'll talk about that in a second with some of our best practices, but that created a different type of environment where you have your IT folks just kind of scrambling to try to keep up and running and keep everything operational, but also make sure that that's secure and safe and remoted in correctly where it's not accessible. The last piece is a really interesting type of exposure in cyber where it doesn't necessarily involve hacking into an actual IT computer system. So when we mention social engineering, we're really talking about the type of a type of fraud and scam that is playing into the actual human person, right? So think about if I'm having a conversation on the street with somebody. Let's say I'm the bad guy. I'm going to go up to somebody and have a conversation on the street, and I'm going to start extracting information from them, whether they are aware that I'm doing it or not. You can do this very skillfully. I would encourage you to watch, if you have a second, it's a video with Jimmy Kimmel Live. He goes, to his audience and he says, yeah, we're going to go down the street of New York City and we're going to ask people their passwords. And the whole audience laughs. And sure enough, they send correspondents down there and they're stopping people on the street and asking for their password. And, what first person stops says, I'm not going to give you my password. It's like, oh, okay, you're right. That would be silly. But what makes a good password anyway? Well, it's the year I graduated college and my cat's name. Oh, where'd you go to college? Oh, I went up to Colgate University. Oh, when'd you graduate? My nephew went there. Oh, I graduated in 1997. And, so now you got the first piece. You're literally watching the social engineering come out. And by the end of it, many, many passwords were grabbed. So that's the kind of social engineering. So you see that over the phone where somebody will be, calling in and pretending to be your favorite nonprofit that you donate to and start extracting information. It's got definitely that feeling of trust and things like that. We see that on emails where, they're social engineering, trying to get, just extract information any way they can, right? And again, that circumvents any sort of antivirus, firewall type IT security that you might have. Hospitality specific risk considerations, and I kind of wanted to throw this slide out for obvious reasons for the member base for ORLA, but think about things that are specific to your industry class and maybe kind of higher on the list of exposure. So if you have a second, definitely Google and do an internet search on dark hotel Wi-Fi exposures. It's a little bit stale now. I mean, this has actually been happening for over a decade, but there are dedicated crime organizations that will focus on what they call dark hotel exposures, where they're going to penetrate the Wi-Fi systems at hotels, and they will sit there and wait. And they will also, many times they will track individual targets. So if you have a, maybe a high executive that is staying at the hotel or a government official, or they will start kind of running a campaign very specific to individuals or groups. And then when they log into that compromised Wi-Fi, they already have a piece of malware kind of waiting for them on the back end. That's kind of the best way to explain it, but definitely an exposure, definitely a target. Again, dependency on third-party vendors, we mentioned that previously. So, and that is, obviously we've got the Microsoft headlines out there, Adobe, like I mentioned before, but third-party vendors in general, let's say you've got a local IT company, they're great. They are doing great work for your computer systems, keep you up and running operationally. Make sure that whichever vendor you're working with also has a pretty sophisticated department dedicated to IT security. It tends to be a completely separate animal, and you want to have the same level of attention that you give to IT operations as you would to IT security. And again, thinking about vendors in general, nobody's impenetrable, nobody's infallible. And so that dependency, you are putting a certain level of trust in those vendors, and we want to make sure that those are vetted completely. But also understand that they fail, right? And what implications does that have on your business with regard to cyber risk and cyber regulatory action? Social engineering fraud controls. These are things that, we talked about before where, are you educating your staff on those kinds of social engineering interactions, right? What does it look like when you get a fraudulent or phishing email that comes through? That's a version of social engineering, right? So it's, can they detect, bad phone calls and people who are trying to extract information from them? So those are the kind of fraud controls, and we'll chat in a second about how specific that is with regard to wire transferring of money, which is another big claim. Other considerations, industrial control systems, we kind of mentioned that up front. What does that look like in your operation? What are those systems tied to? Is it tied to a main server where you're monitoring, heat and temperature and security and things like that? Or are they completely separate? How is that configured? That's kind of the biggest question. Another really interesting vulnerability is remote access vulnerability. So, there are operationally, this all kind of definitely makes sense. You have a business, you might allow a vendor to have remote access for various reasons. If you have a vendor that's monitoring your HVAC, they might have a remote access into your system so they don't have to come physically all the time to your building, especially during COVID. We've seen a big spike of this. If anyone's familiar with the Target breach, which was a huge headline, right, a few years back, that Target breach was actually caused by one of their HVAC vendors, a company called Fazio Mechanical that had remote access vulnerability into the Target system. Fazio was the one that was hacked into, and then when the hackers got in there, they realized they could backdoor into some very, very big companies such as Target, right? So think about who you're allowing into your environment, and what are the security protocols around that. And those tend to be big vulnerabilities. And then again, just beating you over the head with this one, but the human factor, right? So start thinking about rogue employee exposures, that's definitely a cultural type thing, but also human error. Understand that you can't slap a firewall and antivirus on all of the exposures that we're talking about here. So what is at risk? So really we're looking back to my failure in my network security caused some economic damage to happen or some sort of liability risk, right? Or my failure to protect private information exposed me to this and, it caused some sort of economic damage or liability, right? So what are the actual risk implications? First and foremost, when all of this kind of happens, you have some sort of incident that happens, you're going to start incurring what we call first party response expenses, right? That's the whole figuring it out cost. What it looks like from the insurance side and what is recommended regardless of insurance is that you pick up the phone and you get on a call with a breach attorney. We call them breach coaches. And there are lots of attorney firms, law firms that are specializing in this space. And so they will kind of act as your quarterback in any sort of incident and help you navigate and kind of bring on all the other team members that will help address the actual response needs. After that, they will, they'll kind of dig into the system. They may find a piece of malware. They may suspect that there's malware in there. They'll bring in a forensics firm that will do the heavy digging. And all of this is kind of costing you and your company first party expenses. And so that's definitely transferable to the policy. And we'll chat about the policy in a second. Beyond that, depending on the type of incident and depending on the type of breach, you could be experiencing, if it's a ransomware situation and you're completely shut down. Let's say the hackers have completely shut down and held your systems hostage. You're no longer able to, generate revenue for a certain amount of time. We're looking for, costs related to business interruption, business income loss, right? That also extends to, the dependent systems that have gone down on your behalf outside of kind of the utilities and just having a power outage. If your dependent system, so web hosting, your, payment service provider, point of sale type stuff, they shut down for a significant amount of time. What does it look like from an economic damage to you and your company when those systems shut down, right? So there's going to be a period of being able to get restitution for that as well. Oftentimes, we do see a destruction of data or actual hardware being destroyed. So there could be a piece of malicious code that actually goes out instead of actually trying to capture information. It may do both or may be designed to just destroy, right? So destroying your data, shutting you down, just a piece of malicious code in general can do a lot of that stuff. And then outside of expenses, we definitely get into an area of legal liability, right? So it could, depending on how bad the situation is, you could be facing class actions of, failing to protect private information, or let's say your computer system was used and, one of your employees sent out accidentally sent out a bad email to another, third-party system and it infects their system as well. Could there be liability transfer there? When we talk about liability from an insurance standpoint, we're talking about defense costs in court just to get it out of court. And just to even if you have a good case, it's going to cost quite a bit of money just to defend those cases. And then you get into the damages realm of, it looks like there's some bad facts here. Liability is on this side. Now you're facing some settlement and damages. Same thing with regulatory issues. If you've got any sort of failure to protect private information, as we discussed before in the legal slide, you're going to have the state attorney general coming for you to say, hey, you didn't make notification in a timely manner. At the very least, they might be investigating the situation and you're going to need to have some sort of response. All of that costs money with legal advice and attorneys and things like that. Other things that have come into play with these types of breach scenarios is your reputation could be at risk as well. Particularly, I don't want to keep picking on Target, but who wanted to shop at Target right after that was disclosed, right? It was just one of those situations where you want to get good PR out there to make sure that your customers are aware and that you're being fully transparent about the situation and that they feel secure and ready to come back and be that loyal customer. So the reputational damage is definitely something that we are now able to quantify and then offset on the insurance contract as well. The last two pieces of what's at risk is definitely money in the fraud scenario of everything. So when we talk about insurance and cyber insurance, particularly, we often are thinking about intangible information, data, information, things that are kind of intangible in nature. When we talk about in the insurance industry, crime, that's really physical type stuff, money, property, securities, things like that. So if a bad guy gets into your system, they have access to both, they're probably going to be going after both, right? So a really common scenario is fraudulent emails that will come through that look like a change of bank information from a vendor, customer, or client. And then maybe one of your employees is kind of duped into sending the invoice in the wrong direction, things like that. So there's definitely a lot of money to be accessed as well in the failure to protect, in your failure of your network security. And the last two pieces are now starting to be contemplated by the insurance market, but bodily injury, property damage, pollution, these are things that tend to not, in the past, have not fallen under coverage for cyber, but there definitely is a risk. So again, hacking into a boiler room and actually blowing up the boiler is something that we have seen. Anyone who's around that could suffer some bodily injury, depending on the situation and the destruction of the hacking of manufacturing systems, or anything that's that could lead to property damage in your facility, or potentially a pollution issue as well. So those are things that are now contemplated as well. I'm not going to spend too much time on these slides, because then the reason is I'm going to send you a link. We're going to give you some really nice resources at the end of this to provide you with this entire claims report. But Net Diligence is a company that actually works with the majority of the cyber insurers in our space, and they collect claims data every year. And the claims study from 2020 is pretty fantastic. I think the biggest trends that I really want everyone to understand is that they're showing that 98% of the claims from are from small to medium-sized businesses with less than 2 million annual revenues. So we'll talk about some of the pushback that I get from my clients as to why they don't think they need the coverage, but a lot of it is we're not that big. We don't have a lot of stuff. We're not on the radar, that type of thing. Cyber and criminal activity is pretty blind. When you're, launching some piece of malicious code out there, they're just trying to figure out which doors and windows are open. And so once they do that, they do find that the small to mid-sized businesses are very accessible, and that they do have quite a bit of information, or they're able to access critical, servers that could, be kind of hijacked for ransom as well. So that's kind of the biggest piece on this one as far as the ransomware. And I'll let everyone kind of digest this on the resources side when we send you this report. The other kind of takeaway that I was kind of gathering from some of our InsurTech partners, we'll talk about InsurTechs in a second, but third-party vendor issues. I can't stress this enough. Your security and you're feeling good, and you're, that level of, I don't have a problem. I've got the best, outsourced IT on the planet. That's great. But there's a lot of studies out there that are showing that this one in particular with Corvus, one of our InsurTechs, showing that 1 in 5 cyber claims originated with their outsourced IT service provider, right? So they are penetrable. They do have flaws, that could be either from the actual vendor making mistakes, or the actual software itself. I actually have recently heard, if people are kind of up to speed with the SolarWinds situation that has happened in the past couple months, they have recently said that could have been caused by an intern setting a really terrible password, SolarWinds 123. So you have to keep in mind that even though you're using outsourced IT and vendors that are coming in and proclaiming that they're going to keep you safe, they're still backed by humans, right? You still have that human vulnerability of setting terrible passwords, or maybe they are rogue a little bit, and things like that. So there is that human factor constantly in any sort of relationship that you have. The other types of claims trends that we're seeing is kind of that failure in your antivirus. So there's a lot of kind of false security on, I've got the world's impenetrable firewall, impenetrable antivirus, things like that. 4 out of 5 attacks evaded the antivirus and intrusion detection, according to one of our big InsurTechs coalition. And once that happens, you need to have things like endpoint detection and things like that to figure out, now that they're behind the wall, what are they getting into, and how do you get that that bad actor out? Average cost of loss according to Coalition, and this is all pistons firing in a bad loss scenario. So you're paying the breach coach, you're paying the forensics, you might have some sort of data, restoration costs, things like that. They're showing an average out of pocket for about $160,000. That's pretty consistent with what we see as well, with a pretty, fairly significant, ransomware attack, things like that. So let's chat about the insurance coverage. And Lori, actually, do we have any questions on the actual threat side?
We don't have any questions yet, no.
Okay. So really the meat and potatoes of this presentation is really to, now we understand the bad guys, the threat environment. Now, let's talk about the good news, right? There's some good products and resources out there for you, particularly in the insurance space. And we're actually really excited. In a couple slides, we're going to share with you what we're specifically doing for ORLA members. But now that you have kind of a background of what the threat is, I thought I'd actually give you a real short history of the insurance marketplace. And if you can kind of think of it as, from the lens of, this is a big insurance industry that's trying to solve the problem of cyber risk, right? And the things that we were presented with on the underwriting side and the agency side back in the day were kind of puzzling and new. So the catch up and creating products to address all this stuff was quite the adventure. But it kind of started in the late 90s when you started to see really problematic virus transmittal type claims, right? So there were products that existed out in the 90s that were addressing things more of the tech exposure of, my computer literally shut down because of a virus, or I sent virus to a third party. What does that look like? So it was a very, very small piece of the puzzle to begin with, right? Then, as I mentioned, in 2003, we started to see privacy notification regulation start passing in the various states. Particularly leading the charge was California. That led to customers and clients saying, hey, I just got notice from the state attorney general from California that I need to make notification. What does that look like? We had, what does that cost? How do I kind of figure this out? So the product started to evolve in that space as well, to address that privacy regulation, picking up notification costs, picking up the attorney's fees, things like that. Then a couple of years later, and I'm sure you've all read about, and if you haven't, you definitely should read about the TJ Maxx breach that I believe actually happened in 2007. That particular criminal was then featured on a show called American Greed. It's a pretty fascinating story, but and at one point that young individual was working for the Secret Service as an insider, but still hacking on the side. And so that kind of around 2005 is when we started to see really big mega breaches. And this was really like the bad guys utilizing the poor kind of, remember the old swipe system instead of preach, we have the chips on our credit cards now. We used to have the old swipes, really going after that vulnerability and grabbing credit card information in big batches, right? So then the insurance industry really had to tackle that. And that was kind of a jumping in point for a lot of other markets to kind of step in and create big programs and insurance towers around that. And then,
Anne, yeah. We did get a question from Michael. He says, we back up our info to the cloud. Under a ransomware scenario, would it be likely that we can restore everything to our system?
Well, it depends. Yeah. So one of our suggestions is to make sure, that the ransomware is completely removed from your server. So it's totally independent. It depends on the cloud. We actually have seen we've seen some very sophisticated ransomware attacks that will not only penetrate your system, but also backdoor into the cloud vendor as well. And so take those out. So it kind of depends on what the accessibility is that is, existing with that third-party vendor hosting that data storage. But we have some suggestions towards the end of how to keep that separate. But, lately I've heard suggestions of kind of a double backup approach, which can be extensive if depends on, what kind of information we're dealing with and stuff like that. But generally that is, you're right on track with using that third party. As long as it's completely segregated, that's a good procedure for sure. And it should work, right? That should prevent you from having to actually pay the demand. The problem is, now that you can get back up and running, that's great. But you might have some compromised information that may have occurred in that process. It may not alleviate the necessity of getting that breach coach involved, getting forensics to just figure out, so those expenses might still kind of wrap around that exposure as well. So hopefully that makes sense. Last piece of the kind of the history part was that, that we kind of saw this big shift, and that's a great question to kind of lead into this, because we saw this big shift from the mega breach territory down into smaller to mid-sized businesses. I mean, even large businesses face this, but ransomware, right? So again, back to that criminal mentality, shifting from the big mega breach data that I can go and sell and make millions of dollars to now I'm just going to mess with these smaller companies and, take them out and extort them and kind of hold them hostage, right? The first crypto ransomware that I had seen, it was called Crypto Locker, and it was in 2011. I was an underwriter at Travelers Insurance, and I remember scratching my head saying, what is this? And ran that up the line to our home office. And within a week, we saw 100 claims in that first week. And so if you can imagine, just the level of activity and the frequency of these has just exploded from there. So cyber underwriters, this is kind of in the early years, as I mentioned, in the 90s and kind of, leading into the early notification laws being passed, there was limited market capacity. I was actually an underwriter at the time, and then I moved to the brokerage side. So I was dealing with a lot of the carriers. Minimum premiums were very expensive. There was not very much capacity. No one was really understanding the risk and not sure when to jump in and how to insure the risk, right? Right around 2010 to 20, we started, even a little bit before that with the mega breaches and stuff like that, we started to really see an increase of capacity. It started with a lot of carriers jumping on board and willing to what we call quota share, or kind of, go in with other markets on the risk and kind of reduce their exposure to it. Then we started to see the applications, started to get a little bit more favorable. In the early years, this is kind of a big thing to understand. In the early years, it was almost a requirement for your company to do a good $10,000 to $15,000 IT security assessment that you would then deliver with your application to the carrier. And then even then you may not get a quote, right? Then, as we got more market capacity and things like that, the rigor of getting through the application process started to reduce. But also nowadays, what we're seeing is that these cyber assessments and things like that are starting to be complementary, right? So it's starting to be kind of folded back into the underwriting process. And so that's where we kind of lead now, is where I kind of call the future of cyber underwriting. And one term I think is really great to know is adversarial underwriting, right? So if you think about the technology and the resources that we have today, especially on the underwriting desk, using, kind of putting that hat on for a second of pretending to be the bad guy, right? And looking at a risk as we're seeing from the underwriting desk as the bad guy and what the vulnerabilities are. So it helps differentiate, one exposure from the next as far as the insureds. But it also, what that looks like is definitely utilizing artificial intelligence, some sophisticated technology as far as vulnerability scans as a part of the underwriting process, so they can actually get a little bit more of a peek behind the curtain, scan your IP addresses for any sort of remote desktop protocol, things of that nature that can much more inform the cyber underwriters of your risk. And so nowadays we see a lot of these reports become complementary, and it's definitely something we've set up for ORLA members as well, to get these complementary vulnerability scans along with your quote to be much more informed about your cybersecurity. So as far as the cyber contract itself, again, I think we've covered a lot of this stuff, but as in talking about the exposures, the cyber insurance contract itself is designed to respond in the way that, you now have an incident on your hands and you're now facing expenses and possible liability, right? The first bucket is going to be those breach response expenses. So as we talked about before, paying the breach attorney's fees, paying the forensics expenses, that team that's going to come in, that's actually pretty expensive. From my experience, any sort of notification costs, crafting those letters with the attorneys. If you need PR, a PR team will be provided. Any sort of customer remediation in the form of, setting up call centers, credit card monitoring, things like that. That's your bucket of breach response expenses. Okay. The next piece I'm going to kind of go across the slide is business loss. So depending on the type of loss scenario, you might have that business interruption going on, right? So then you're going to look to the policy to reimburse you for your net loss of a certain amount of time that your servers were unavailable and you weren't, making any money. And that includes that extension for systems failure for dependent systems and things of that nature too. Then we get into data restoration, the costs associated with getting that good information back and restored to where it was prior to the breach incident. So restoring the information on particular servers that were compromised and things like that. It may actually involve computer replacement. So we do have little bits and pieces of what we call betterment coverage. So if there is a attack scenario where, the piece of code or malicious software comes in and actually destroys the actual computer system, there's reimbursable expenses to get you back up and running and even a little bit better than what you were before as far as the actual hardware that you're working on. And then again, we have reimbursable expenses for the reputational harm as well. And then cyber crime. So again, when we talked about data versus actual tangible money and securities. So there are bits and pieces of cyber crime baked into these cyber policies these days, where if a bad guy's in your system and starts moving and manipulating accounts and money, maybe setting up some ghost accounts or false vendors, manipulating invoices, maybe sets up a fake payroll account for a fraudulent employee, things like that. It'll also address the scenario where you're getting a fraudulent email that looks like, a vendor or some sort of invoice request that has then been manipulated and it's just not caught. And one of your employees sends money out the door. So there's going to be a nice supplement of coverage baked in for that kind of crime feature. And then the last but not least is kind of what I call the legal liability. I call it the other shoe that drops, right? And a lot of times, and this is actually good news, if you've got good breach response going on in any sort of cyber incident, there's a good chance that you're not going to be pulled into a courtroom setting. The legal liability that we see is pretty, it's not always the case, but it definitely tends to be, there was a failure on your part to actually make the notification, or it just wasn't, there was a lack of transparency, or kind of like the actual response to the incident was not good. And that's where you will be pulled into a courtroom scenario. And again, addressing defense costs, damages in the courtroom scenario, the policy will pick up your attorneys to do that, as well as any sort of settlement that might come. Quick note to discuss media liability. So a media liability piece is kind of a tag on to the legal, and I don't think we address that. Is any sort of copyright trademark infringement that might exist on your website or on your emails or things like that. So that's, you get a little bit of the cease and desist actions to start, but it could be, it could actually lead you more into a courtroom setting as well. We have seen some cyber incidences where bad guys breach the actual website and put some really malicious content on there. And there's going to be a carve back of coverage for any sort of mental anguish, emotional distress allegation based on the content that folks are seeing. So keeping that website really tight and secure and making sure there's no malicious content on is pretty important as well. So that's the media piece. And then outside of the, as expressed before, outside of the actual coverage points that I just articulated, the cyber insurance contract is now coming with proactive IT security services. So, one of those things is just, I keep reiterating this, but it's more than just an insurance policy. So we've got streamlined incident response. So that's that phone call away. You've got the vulnerability scanning that's happening in the underwriting process, and then as a policyholder will be continuous throughout your cycle of your policy. And then each carrier is kind of offering different things: dark web monitoring, attack service monitoring, really endpoint encryption software, deep discounts to get some of the stuff up and running for your own IT environment. So I do encourage everyone to think about this, not just from a risk management standpoint on the financial, kind of the CFO desk or the risk manager's desk, but also bring in your IT department. What are the budgetary items on their desk, and how can we offset with these good risk management products and tools? Okay, so we are really, really excited to announce that Ward Insurance has partnered with ORLA to create a proprietary member product, a member program for ORLA members. So what you get is a pre-negotiated contract. We've gone to market. We actually have a couple of interested carriers, so it's going to actually look more like a panel. You get pre-negotiated terms and conditions. We've got a ORLA member discount that'll be available to you. And then again, we also have the complimentary cybersecurity services, that full risk engineering support on the back end. Also the vulnerability scans. Ward is also in the process of creating a bunch of vendor discounts for our policyholders and customers as well, that you'll see on our landing page. And then the biggest thing is streamlined application and kind of that quote to bind, right? This used to be such a nightmare to get even a quote out the door. It's going to be quick and easy. It'll probably take you less than 5 minutes. The turnaround to get a quote and your vulnerability scan will be within 24 hours. So how to obtain a quote, we've got a landing page set up for you. And then in that landing page, in the intake questions, that'll again take less than 5 minutes. There's going to be a request of, letting us know if you're part of an association. Please put in ORLA and you'll get that member discount. And then if you don't like the landing page for whatever reason, feel free to email directly to cyber@wardinsurance.net. And all we need is your website, annual revenues, and employee count. And we can kind of run these quotes for you and kind of loop you into this discount. I'm going to, and Lori will be distributing this, send out our resources page. It'll have more information about this program in more specificity, and your access points as far as the landing page as well. But definitely check it out. It's quick and easy, and a lot of great resources to access. All right, so this is what I used to call this the Heisman moment when I'm selling insurance. That's the get out of my office. I don't want to buy anymore. So we have kind of the 4 top myths that I get is we don't need cyber coverage. The number one is like, we're not a Target. We literally not Target or not TJ Maxx, not Sony. We're not the big guys, right? As expressed before, the cyber criminal activity is pretty blind. And when you think about let's think about a burglar going down the street, checking doors and windows, and which, TV is available in a certain house, they're going to kind of jump in the open door or window, right? A cyber criminal launches a piece of code, out into the internet. And if they are finding open doors and windows anywhere, it could be any size company, any industry class, they're going to go in there and try to exploit, right? And see what they can find. And that could be a target on your third-party vendor that you're using, and then it could backdoor into your system. It could be, that you're being flagged as well. So that's definitely, first and foremost on that first bullet point there. We use the cloud. I think we've expressed enough that, the cloud is great. It's definitely a relevant model for, your ID dependency and setting up your entire operational environment. But the cloud vendors that are coming in, they're not impenetrable. They, again, they're backed by humans. They're also targeted. They also are using software that have, these 0-day vulnerabilities, things of that nature. So just because you use the cloud doesn't offset the risk. It also is interesting to note that from a liability standpoint, if I'm a customer at a restaurant and I go and give my credit card to my server, and then it's eventually lost, whether or not it's actually, stored at the restaurant or it's actually stored in the cloud, there's still a huge chance that I'm going to sue that restaurant for failing to protect my information. The reason is I gave it to them, and then they decided to use a cloud vendor that I could, possibly articulate that was a bad choice, or, this and that. So either way, you're still going to have a liability issue that may drag you into court just to defend it alone. The we are impenetrable is always an interesting one where, that actually is only really talking about the network security side of it. When you really think about impenetrability, you're thinking about firewall, things that you can kind of shore up from an IT security standpoint. Well, think about that human factor again. If you have a rogue employee that has all the keys to the kingdom, as with regard to passwords and things like that, there's a huge vulnerability there, especially when we consider the human error as well. And then we already have coverage. There are pieces of coverage for cyber that exist in maybe your package policy and things of that nature that are small sublimits. They tend to be too small for the types of claims that we see, and it creates interesting challenges when you meet that $50,000 threshold or $100,000 threshold, and then now you're on the hook after that. So I definitely recommend a full-blown cyber policy if you don't have one already. It also, the small stuff that you might have coverage for in your other lines of coverage, if it's not a standalone product, it's not going to come with a lot of the bells and whistles as far as the coverage items, but also the services that I've explained before. I just have a couple more minutes here. So these are kind of the security recommendations. I kind of lump these into two categories. One is technical. Technical security recommendations are definitely implementing multi-factor authentication, two-factor authentication, which is just critical in a time of, and I'm actually going to jump down to number 2, when we have those remote access vulnerabilities, right? So if folks are kind of remoting in, you want to make sure that we're secured behind VPNs. We've got the right, proper security as far as logins to secured servers, right? So if you don't have MFA, we actually have seen some claim statistics. Some of our insurtechs are saying that implementing MFA, if you don't have it already, will reduce your claims by almost 80%. So that's definitely a huge factor. I think I have a question on that.
Yeah. So from Bill, how do we count seasonal employees with us 5 to 6 months and gone? Do they count as one employee or one half employee? Example, Jim works October through March, then his position is filled by Bob from April through September, then he leaves and Ralph comes for 6 months. So it's only one position year round, but filled by seasonal employees.
Yeah, that's interesting because I also handle employment practices liability, and that's where you'd kind of think of them as half employee to quantify the risk. With cyber, those count as full records. It's important to kind of look at individuals on staff as records. So it's whatever file you may have carried on them for the short time they were there, how long that's going to sit in the the backup storage, what kind of information you might have on those seasonal employees still counts as like kind of another hit on your record count. So when we look at cyber and we're definitely looking at the record count. I think you might be referring to if we want the employee count as well. I would definitely add those in to the employees because we're definitely looking at them more as records than actual part-time, full-time. Hopefully that makes sense. Establish routine offsite backups. We had just already chatted about that. So again, making sure that that is completely an offsite location, completely separate from your main business network. And then implementation of endpoint detection. So endpoint detection is a security feature that you can implement that that'll start providing alerts and monitoring when a malicious code gets past your firewalls, right? So that's really important to have. And again, back to the statistics of, I think it was 4 out of 5 will pass the firewall, right? So endpoint detection is available through a lot of our insurance partners at a really, really deep discount. And it's something that I think, Bitdefender, I think is one of them that you can definitely offset your security budget and find resources there through the risk management channels. And then the last kind of, security recommendation bucket that I put together was the human factor. So really for the funds transfer fraud, we see this very, very commonly. That's that fake wire transfer. Hey, we changed banks, send your money out here this way. What we really want to make sure we're paying attention to is educating staff on those click-throughs, protocols to actually, if there are changes in any sort of vendor, banking accounts or relations or anything of that nature, that there are protocols in place where you're going to actually make a callback verification to a number that you've had on file, not the number that's coming in through the fraudulent communication, but there's steps and procedures in place to actually verify those types of requests. Because you'd be surprised how many 6-figure or more wire transfers that go out the door and they're just gone. So dual oversight, things like that. And then the last piece is really creating a security culture in your environment, no matter how small or large you are, creating that security awareness with all of your staff so that they can understand, the click-throughs on fraudulent phishing campaigns or and I've gotten some very weird phone calls that are trying to extract information. So things like that, creating that in a security culture. We have found that, you can do security awareness training and phishing campaigns also found in some of these products. And that folks actually when they're rewarded for doing well and reporting bad emails, they actually really, really will get on top of this instead of being more punitive about it and reprimanding the folks that keep clicking through over and over again. finding a way to reward them, rewarding the success of like doing the right thing. A suspicious email goes to your right, IT contacts, and that whole security culture thing is very, very big. Okay, so last slide. We've got resources that we'll be sending your way. We've got I'll be sending the presentation slide deck here. I will be sending that net diligent cyber claim study. I think it's pretty fantastic to read. It gives you kind of slices and dices the actual exposures and what our industry has been paying out on. We'll give you more information on the ORLA cyber program, and I've got some great resources and security advisories coming from our InsurTech partners. And then Krebs on Security is a great blog and a guy to follow. You can follow him on LinkedIn. He's got his own blog. Brian Krebs, he was a former investigative journalist that's gotten heavily into the cybersecurity space, and just is always up to speed with kind of the latest and greatest and headlines.
Great.
That is it.
Well, Anne, thank you so much for presenting today. I think there was a ton of great information there, so I appreciate that. And like you said, we'll send out some additional links and information and recording shortly to attendees, and also have it available on ORLA's website. So I think we are done. We don't have any further questions, so thank you so much. We'll wrap it up.
Thank you.